We may now turn to the last of the enlightened despots, the rulers of the Habsburg dominions in Austria. Now, here we have a curiosity. We have Maria Theresa and her son Joseph II, who is known as probably the most enlightened in a way of the enlightened despots, ruled together from 1765 to 1780. Thereafter, Joseph ruled alone.
Maria Theresa Walburga Amelia Christiana started her 40 years long reign when her father, Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI, died in October 1740. Charles VI had failed to produce a male heir, so he had issued the Pragmatic Sanction of 1713, which placed his nieces behind his own daughters in the line of succession. The Pragmatic Sanction paved the way for Maria Theresa's accession to the throne. She was the only female ruler of Habsburg dominions. Maria had married Francis Stephen of Lorraine in 1736 and had become the Grand Duchess of Tuscany. She and Francis had 16 children, including Queen Marie Antoinette of France. During her coronation, she was pregnant with her third child. However, after her father's death, Saxony, Prussia, Bavaria and France refused to honor the Pragmatic Sanction they had recognized during his lifetime. This sparked off a 9 years long conflict known as the War of Austrian Succession. King Frederick II of Prussia invaded Silesia and requested that Maria Theresa cede it. He threatened to join her enemies if she refused. Maria Theresa decided to fight for the mineral-rich province. She was confident that she would retain the jewel of the House of Austria. Maria Theresa bitterly recalled in a political testament the circumstances under which she had ascended. I found myself without money, without credit, without army, without experience and knowledge of my own, and finally, also without any counsel. Because each one of them at first wanted to wait and see how things would develop. Maria's father, Emperor Charles VI, had hoped for a son till his dying years, so he had never prepared his daughter for her future role as sovereign, even though she had secured Maria's inheritance to the throne. Maria Theresa was the sovereign of Austria, Hungary, Croatia, Bohemia, Mantua, Milan, Lodomeria and Galicia, the Austrian Netherlands and Burma.
Maria Theresa recognized the need for reforms at the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763. Austria had done badly, and the status of Austria as a great power, one of the strongest power in Europe, had indeed been in some question. And therefore, she realized the need to restore the authority of the state, to tone up the administration, and to introduce reforms. She had the support of her Chancellor Kaunitz in all this. They understood the need for reform, and they started by toning up the administration first. There was an attempt to make the central authority more effective. A Staatsmet had already been established in 1761. Its authority or power had been increased in the mid-1760s, and it was put under Hatzfeld. It had the authority to control all internal matters.
Maria Theresa understood the importance of a public persona and was able to simultaneously evoke both esteem and affection from her subjects. Maria Theresa initiated financial and educational reforms, promoted commerce and the development of agriculture, and reorganized Austria's ramshackle military, all of which strengthened Austria's international standing.
A second objective was to restore the military effectiveness of Austria. This was an expensive proposition. Therefore, it was necessary to raise more resources. Maria Theresa knew that the lower orders were not in a position to pay more, overburdened as they already had been. Therefore, she wanted to apportion a greater share onto the higher orders, mainly the nobles and the church in particular, which was quite rich.
She implemented significant reforms to strengthen Austria's military and bureaucratic efficiency. She employed Count Frederick Wilhelm von Haugwitz, who modernized the empire by creating a standing army of 108,000 men. In 1760, Maria Theresa created the Council of State, composed of the State Chancellor, 3 members of high nobility and 3 knights, which served as a committee of experienced people who advised her. The Council of State lacked executive or legislative authority, but nevertheless set an example remarkably different from the form of government employed by Frederick II of Prussia. Unlike the latter, Maria Theresa was not an autocrat who acted as her own minister. Prussia would adopt this form of government only after 1807.
It was thus imperative that the higher orders should be taxed, and in this she was not inspired by any philosophy or any enlightenment. It was the practical needs of the state, as it is known as the raison d'etat, reasons of a state.
Maria Theresa doubled the state revenue between 1754 and 1764. Though her attempt to tax the clergy and the nobility was only partially successful, these financial reforms greatly improved the economy.
In 1764, she summoned the feudal lords, the clerical orders in a provincial estate of Hungary, and she wanted all of them to increase the share of tax that they paid. She was against any further burden on the peasants. The assembly agreed to pay an enhanced tax, but they absolutely refused to lessen the burden of feudal obligation on the peasants. Maria Theresa was, however, determined to bring this down.
In 1771, she and Joseph issued the robot patent, a reform that provided some relief to the serfs. Financially, in 1775, the monarchy's budget was balanced for the first time in history.
Between 1767 and 75, she promulgated several decrees to reduce the burden of feudal dues on the peasants in such areas as Hungary, Austria, Silesia, Lower Austria, Moravia, and Bohemia. Forced labor was now restricted to between 1 and 3 days in a week. And the reason she introduced these reforms was that she was aware of the importance of a contented peasantry for the economy. She was a conservative and was not really influenced by philosophy, yet her reforms were by all standard progressive.
Like all members of the House of Habsburg, Maria Theresa was a devout Roman Catholic. She believed that religious unity was necessary for a peaceful public life and explicitly rejected the idea of religious toleration. However, she never allowed the church to interfere with what she considered to be prerogatives of a monarch and kept Rome at arm's length. She controlled the selection of archbishops, bishops, and abbots.
She also wanted to collect money from the church, and she did this gradually. She had even got into a conflict with the Pope over this. She was a devout Catholic. She had no wish to offend either the church or the Pope, but she wanted to collect money from them, and this is what she did. In 1767, church property in Milan was confiscated. She imposed a clergy on the tax later in 1768.
Maria's relationship with the Jesuits was of a complex nature. Members of this order educated her, served as her confessors, and supervised the religious education of her eldest son. The Jesuits were powerful and influential in the early years of Maria Theresa's reign. However, the Queen's ministers managed to convince her that they posed a danger to her monarchical authority.
Jesuit activities were stopped, and their income was transferred to the local parish churches. And some of this money was used to fund primary education. And the purpose of this elementary education was to produce useful, obedient, and Christian citizens.
Though she eventually gave up trying to convert her non-Catholic subjects to Roman Catholicism, Maria Theresa regarded both the Jews and Protestants as dangerous to the state and actively tried to suppress them. The Empress was probably the most anti-Semitic monarch of her day. Maria Theresa was a conservative in manners of state as in those of religion, but she forbade forceful conversion of Jewish children to Christianity and supported Jewish commercial and industrial activity.
Now, therefore, what is central to understanding Maria's impulse to reform was the need to make the state more effective. If the economy improved, if the peasants were contented to improve agriculture and economy, if the administration ran better, if the state was run better, then all these would result in making Austria a great power once more. It will remove the weaknesses that Austria had faced for some time.
Among other reforms was Codex Theresianus, begun in 1752 and finished in 1766, that defined civil rights. In 1776, Austria outlawed witch burnings and torture, and for the first time in Austrian history took capital punishment off the penal code. It was replaced with forced labor. Maria Theresa was opposed to the abolition of torture. Capital punishment was later reintroduced, but the progressive nature of these reforms remains noted.
Now again, to emphasize or to re-emphasize, behind this there was no inspiration of philosophy, purely the reasons of state.
Aware of the inadequacy of bureaucracy in Austria and in order to improve it, Maria Theresa reformed education in 1775. In a new school system based on the Prussian model, all children of both genders from ages of 6 to 12 had to attend school. Education reform was met with hostility from many villages. Maria Theresa crushed the dissent by ordering the arrest of all those who opposed. Although the idea had merit, the reforms were not as successful as they were expected to be. In some parts of Austria, half of the population was illiterate well into the 19th century. The Empress permitted non-Catholics to attend university and allowed the introduction of secular subjects, such as law, which influenced the decline of theology as the main foundation of university education. As a young monarch who fought 2 dynastic wars, she believed that her cause should be the cause of her subjects. But in her later years, she would believe that their cause must be hers. Maria Theresa possessed qualities appreciated in a monarch: warm heart, practical mind, firm determination, and sound perception. Most importantly, she was ready to recognize the mental superiority of some of her advisors. She gave them due respect and allowed them to form policies. She enjoyed their support even if their ideas differed from her own. At the age of 63, Maria Theresa died on the 29th of November 1780 at the Hofburg Palace in Vienna. During her reign, her husband Francis and later her eldest son Joseph II had been her co-regents.
After her death, from 1780 onwards, Joseph alone ruled Austria. Joseph has often been seen as a tragic figure of a reformer. It is usually considered that here was a reformer or a ruler who was most influenced by enlightenment. And as we have noted earlier, he wanted philosophy to legislate for his empire. In the main, he continued the work of his mother of the earlier period, though he felt that the reform or the work of reform was still incomplete.
Joseph continued the reforms along the lines pursued by his mother, but mother and son had sharply different motivations. Maria Theresa was a pious Catholic empress walking within the structure of paternalistic Baroque absolutism. Joseph, in contrast, gave the reforms an ideological edge, reflecting the utilitarian theories of the Enlightenment. Because his reforms were more ideologically driven and thus less flexible and pragmatic, they frequently were also less successful and disrupted the stability of the Habsburg Empire.
He gave a greater accent to the reform of the economy. And here again, we must concede that raison d'etat took precedence over any new ideas that we might detect in this. He realized that the war, repeated war, had revealed the weakness of Austria, and this could be changed by increasing the military strength of Austria. And this was necessary so that Austria could also expand her dominions. Her success in the first, that is, making Austria a little more effective, had been more than offset by her attempt to extend Austria's dominions and thereby very often get involved in conflict and in substantial loss of sources in terms of men and money.
Joseph's utilitarianism contributed to two important divergences from Maria Theresa's policy: greater religious toleration and suppression of religious customs deemed contrary to utilitarian principles. The Edict of Tolerance issued in 1781 granted Protestants almost equal status with Catholics. Other decrees lifted restrictions on Jews and opened up communities, trades, and educational opportunities previously barred to them. The utilitarian principles behind religious toleration, however, also inspired Joseph to dissolve Catholic monasteries that were dedicated solely to contemplative religious life. He appropriated the property of monasteries and was keen to use them for the state. Factories and warehouses were set up in many old monastic buildings. A lot of land also came into the market. He sought to control even the seminaries.
Joseph correctly diagnosed that the economic development of Austria was absolutely essential, and this lack of economic development lay at the root of Austria's weakness. He wanted to improve economic parameters in trade, industry, and agriculture. He adopted a threefold policy of economy in expenditure, collection of more taxes from the higher orders, and a general development of the economy. He set a personal example in this. He led an unostentatious lifestyles. Even in education, there was control, and higher education was to be restricted. Only some of the universities like Louvain, Pavia had been spared, and his economy here affected even his favorite composer Mozart.
The reforms created an administrative, fiscal, and judicial bureaucracy directly responsible to the monarch.
He sincerely believed that taxes need to be distributed among all the classes, and therefore he wanted to reform the existing and unequal tax system. He started the process by registering all land. It was not an easy task. He started a census in Hungary, and he obviously had the influence of physiocratic ideas on this. He started by abolishing serfdom also through two decrees in 1781 and 82. The census was started, land census, in Hungary in 1784, and it was completed later by 1785 in other regions like Austria and Bohemia. By 1789, a land register had been prepared, and everyone was to pay a uniform land tax of 12%. So while the higher orders paid only 12%, the peasants had to pay 17% as the feudal obligation to the others. So the lower orders paid certainly more than the higher orders, but at least the higher orders were obliged to share the burden of taxation now. The influence of ideas again would be clear in Joseph's statement that the nobles would go hungry if there were no peasants to till the land. So the peasants needed a better deal so that even the higher orders could pay.
As the seat of the new centralized institutions, Vienna grew from merely being a sovereign's place of residence to a true political and administrative capital. Hungary, however, was not included in these centralizing administrative reforms. In appreciation of the support Austria had received from the Hungarian nobles during the War of Austrian Succession, Maria Theresa never extended her reforms to that kingdom.
He expected the reform to increase the economic condition of Austria. He restricted the power of the guilds, and indeed trade was encouraged, and some form of protectionism was introduced in mid-1780s. Trading in the Danubian region flourished. In certain areas, there had been increase in the production also, in the mining, in textile, particularly in Bohemia, Lower Austria, Tyrol and Styria. Mining and textile industries were rejuvenated. The number of factories indeed became doubled in Bohemia. He introduced religious toleration in order to encourage economic activities. He argued very strongly that one's religion cannot stand in the way of economy. Through these series of measures, he did succeed in rejuvenating Austrian economy to an extent, trade, agriculture as well as industry, and it was reflected in the fairly significant increase in the quantum of revenue that was collected. It grew up from 65 million florin in 1781 to 87 million florin in 1788. Vienna became a very significant urban agglomeration with about 200,000 people. This fairly impressive success, however, did not last long. Joseph withdrew many of his reforms later, and all this may in a way be related to his failure in foreign policy. He took several measures to strengthen the army. He even introduced partial conscription. He participated in the first partition of Poland. In the late 1770s, he tried to invade Bavaria and found Frederick to be a very serious adversary, and actually his aggressive foreign policy resulted in substantial loss of both men and money.
Frederick the Great is said to have found Joseph ambitious, despotic and capable of setting the world on fire.
The reforms also created an expectation which he failed to fulfill. In fact, lower classes did not get the taste of real freedom. On the other hand, upper orders were against him because of the relative reduction in their privileges. The empire then experienced increasing restlessness. Faced with this, Joseph gradually lost his cool, and reforms were gradually withdrawn. In 1785, he started policing the people. In 1788, orthodox attitude towards religion was reinforced. Even a censor system was introduced later. Only the abolition of serfdom and religious toleration among his many reforms remained. Actually, his ultimate failure had been summed up by the immortal words Joseph himself had written for his epitaph. Quote, "Here lies the man who, with best of intentions, never succeeded in anything." This, in a way, sums up the career of Joseph II.
Joseph II died in 1790. He had no children. He was succeeded by his brother Leopold II.
The most significant of the minor rulers had been Leopold, the Grand Duke of Tuscany. He has been recognized as a truly enlightened rule in the contemporary context. He curbed the domination of the church. He imbibed the physiocratic ideas through his minister Neri. He encouraged agriculture, restricted the guild, removed restrictions on grain trade, and this generally tended to make Tuscan economy more mobile. But the most remarkable of his reforms was the introduction of a constitution in 1782. This constitution provided for a central assembly, without whose permission the succession of a king would not be granted. There would be necessary to take its permission for change, for war, etc. And it has been described as one of the major documents in pre-revolutionary, constitutional document in pre-revolutionary Europe. He wrote something to his sister which is worth quoting. He informed his sister that, quote, every country needs a fundamental law, a contract between the people and the sovereign, which limits the power and authority of the latter. When the sovereign breaks the contract, he renounces his office, which is only given to him on the condition that the people are no longer obliged to obey him. Unquote. It is, however, ironical that all these reforms had come to naught, particularly when Leopold took over as the King of Austria, though there were no reforms.
The reality of much political life in 18th century Europe was that of the monarchs, their personalities, ambitions and limitations. It is these individuals who have attracted most of the attention of historians. Historians have commented that the only feeling which all the enlightened despots shared was their common feeling for the state, and that no principle unites them, no practice endows them. Many of these historians have stressed the practical aspects of these governments and have paid less attention to the theories which might have been behind them.
Maria Theresa was a conservative, whereas Joseph has often been described as the philosopher-statesman. Indeed, he himself claimed to have made, quote, philosophy the legislator of my empire, unquote. Yet his life remains an ironical statement of his work as a ruler.